Hello Darklings! So today I wanted to talk about the history of the universal horror film and the foundation for the horror movie genre. So most of this information is gleaned from a few books such as David Cano's Real Terror and David J. Scull's The Monster Show. David J. Scull is one of the premier experts on horror movies. His stuff is well researched and fun to read. If you want to know more, I highly suggest his work. Otherwise, everything else can be found pretty much in this Universal Monsters collection book, which I've mentioned before. I think it's like $35 on Amazon. So, when you think of the classic when you think of classic horror movies and classic monsters, you probably think of Dracula, Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Mummy, The Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon, all of which came out of the Universal Studios lots. So this was a very big company starting in the 19-teens, and they mostly did what most other films were doing at that time. They were doing shorts, serials, and all kinds of different films in whatever lots they could scramble up in the budding wasteland that was Hollywood in the 19-teens. However, the U.S. was introduced to three very particular German films that highly influenced the style of the horror film in America, which is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, A Symphony of Horror, and the sci-fi epic Metropolis. This is the complete Metropolis, which is admittedly probably not the version they saw. And those definitely had a high amount of impact on the way that film was done. I suggest those three films to anybody ever because they're silent, but they have influenced film history totally. So when you first really get silent horror in the US, one person in particular comes to mind, and that would be Lon Chaney. And I am a huge Lon Chaney fan. I have his face tattooed on my leg. I read 2 biographies on him in college and did an essay on him. He was a really cool guy. Born of deaf parents, which helped with his vaudevillian skills. Apparently a very talented dancer and singer, though there's sadly no recordings of his singing voice, and he only ever did one talkie before his death. So he was a very influential and very prominent movie star in the 1920s, and he was known as the Man of a Thousand Faces, which ended up becoming a film in 1954. But things such as The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera were some very premier examples of suspense and horror pictures. And these horror pictures were not especially well liked by Carl Laemmle, the founder of Universal, and his son Carl Laemmle Jr. They were the ones that were controlling on the money, but these were the movies that were making the money. Even if they didn't like making them because they considered them to be kind of low class, they ended up making multiple horror pictures because they seemed to draw in the crowds like nothing else. Other horror comedy things such as The Cat and the Canary also fared very well for Universal. Then you get probably one of the biggest, most interesting kind of problem films that Universal had to deal with. In 1930, Lon Chaney passed away of throat cancer, and so his offered role for the highly coveted adaptation of Dracula, based off of the stage production, not the novel, was going to be filmed, and Todd Browning was kind of devastated over Lon's death. And you ended up getting the stage actor, who actually came from Logos, Hungary, Bela Blaskos, aka Bela Lugosi, who ended up playing Dracula. He was not terribly well liked by his peers because of his strange mannerisms and how little English he spoke and learned all of his lines phonetically. But the film, despite its lack of continuity, no real soundtrack, and kind of strange logic jumps, ended up becoming a cult hit. It has been back and forth one of the best worst films, it seems, for the horror franchise. As much as I love the film, I do acknowledge its problems, and I understand why they are there. It did end up spawning some sequels, such as Dracula's Daughter, which was a very interesting, scandalous film due to its lesbian undertones, and Son of Dracula, which was just Lon Chaney Jr. playing his hand at being Dr. Alucard, which is, or Count Alucard, which is just supposed to be Dracula. It's a very odd, entertaining film set in the South. But it's kind of interesting to see which of these films struck gold. Probably the better between Dracula was Frankenstein. Frankenstein was ultimately a better film, and it was interesting because James Whale ended up becoming a much better known director within Hollywood circles in the 1930s. Despite being an openly gay man in Hollywood, he ended up striking far more success than Todd Browning did, and Frankenstein ended up becoming a huge hit. There was one scene in particular that caused a large amount of problems, which was the death of the girl, that was cut from most releases and then reinstated in DVD release. Its sequel, Bride of Frankenstein, is actually really interesting because, in my opinion, it's a little bit better than Frankenstein itself, which is why I have the bride tattooed on my leg. And this was an interesting one because the Laemmles went to Europe for a trip, and then James Whale did whatever he wanted to do with this one, which was probably for the better because with that creative freedom, he ended up making a very good film. He, however, did not return for any of the subsequent sequels. Son of Frankenstein is the last time that Boris Karloff appears as the monster. And it's kind of interesting that history remembers Karloff best for his portrayal of Frankenstein's monster, despite the fact that he was in more than 80 films prior to being the monster. Son of Frankenstein also features Bela Lugosi's probably best performance of his career as Igor, the assistant. Ghost of Frankenstein is a little schlocky. Other great ones, and another great adaptation from James Whale is The Invisible Man, which has all the right notes of humor and cleverness that made the H.G. Wells novella popular, with a very young Claude Rains as the Invisible Man. His voice carried the performance very well. Another popular James Whale or Karl Freund adaptation is The Mummy, also featuring Boris Karloff. After his portrayal in Frankenstein, his career skyrocketed, and so he went simply by Karloff, because unlike Bela Lugosi, he embraced his typecasting because he rather liked paychecks. Another fun, oft-forgotten one by some modern audiences from James Whale, again, is The Old Dark House, which was another entertaining treat. But then fast forward into the 40s, when Universal doesn't have quite as much money and they are kind of having some pitfalls due to having a lot of sequels and franchises that were not faring as well as the originals. And then you do get some fresh blood into their classics, which includes The Wolfman. This also features Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, House of Dracula, Werewolf of London, and She-Wolf of London. Werewolf in London was the first time that a werewolf was featured in a Universal production in 1935. But this film ended up becoming far more popular than its predecessor and skyrocketed Lon Chaney Jr. to some fame, despite not following his father's warnings to not get into show business, and so he ended up dying premature death of alcohol poisoning. But all of this information is hard to cram in because my brain is going faster than my mouth. And anyway, all the Wolfman films are kind of worth it. In the 40s and at the tail end of the 40s, you end up getting a lot of creature feature mashup films. That's when you get your Dracula versus Frankenstein and your Frankenstein versus the Wolfman films. Is they kind of were running out of ideas and they decided to pull out their heavyweights and have them fight each other. But for the most part, during the 1940s, the better horror films ended up coming from a smaller company, RKO, which is how you get I Walked with a Zombie and Cat People, which are considered classics in their own right. But for the 1950s, the biggest amount of fresh blood came from The Creature from the Black Lagoon in 1952, or 1954, and then its subsequent, not quite as good sequels. Basically, that is the short of classic Universal horror. These films are very widely known, even by people that have never seen them, and they have made a very strong foundation for the rest of the horror industry. And they even got their own subsequent remakes and reissues in Technicolor through a film company in England that I will talk about at another time. Anyway, I hope this gives you a kind of idea of the basis of where our favorite horror movies come from. Till next time, Darklings.